Okay, so last session, I think I had promised you a primer on the Holy Roman Empire, and so that's what we're going to do today. Is take a look at the Holy Roman Empire. As an aside, you can see I got my haircut, which is long time in coming. 2 months, 3 months is far too long to wait to get that done. So thankfully that's been done. Now I'm a little bit more presentable. So today we're going to be looking at the Holy Roman Empire. So I think what we'll do, this might be a bit of a shorter lesson today. And then what we're going to do next week is we're going to take a look at the investiture controversy, which was a battle between the Pope and the Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, as to who had the authority to invest bishops and abbots and other churchmen, who had the authority to appoint them, to give them their office, and to who did these guys owe their fealty to. So that's what we're going to take a look at next week. So this week we're going to look at sort of an overview of the Holy Roman Empire, kind of look at where it starts, and hopefully this will give you a basis of knowledge that when we talk about the empire going forward, you have an idea of what it is. Now, the Holy Roman Empire is not specifically medieval. It has its origins in the Middle Ages, but it is not. But it continues until 1806. So let's take a look and get started here. So the Holy Roman Empire, historians love to say, or they love this statement: it is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. They like to say it's like a myth. It's a historical fiction almost, but it's not. It really isn't. It's a real entity that existed for well over 1,000 years, or for over 1,000 years, that had an impact on European history, and in particular on German history and on church history. And so the Holy Roman Empire is fairly important from our standpoint, anyway. And it's important that we understand it. We have to remember that, like I said earlier, the idea of Rome. When I was talking about Rome, when we did the session on Rome, the idea of Rome and what it represented is very important in the European history, and it's still with us today. And the evoking the imperium of Rome, the might of Rome, the idea of the emperor as the great Christian or the great defender of the church was really something that stuck through, and particularly in the early part of the empire. So, as I was saying before, the Holy Roman Empire existed from about 800 to 1806. There's a few points in there where you can say there wasn't an emperor and there was no empire, but by and large, it lasted about 1,006 years. The empire has a reputation, like I was saying, in European history of being a bit of a secondary player. It was like a vestigial tale almost, something that's kind of quirky and interesting, but of not much use, kind of like your appendix. But the impact of the empire on European history has been big, and just one example of that is to look at marriage. And I'm not talking about marriage as an institution, but more marriage as marriages in general. Because if you look at a lot of European monarchs, particularly in the Russian imperial family and in the British royal family, and I believe, in the Danish royal family and in the Greek royal family, there is a surprising number of princes of those families or princesses of those families marrying German nobles and German princes whose realms were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Why is that? Why would that be? I mean, don't princesses and princes marry to establish connections and create dynastic connections between families to secure treaties and whatnot and to perpetuate wealth? And the answer is yes. But the problem is that when you don't have a dance partner among the great powers, you still need to marry your kids off to someone of an appropriate rank. Rank is important when it comes to European history, and in particular European rulers. Rank is a big deal. Royal families, traditionally speaking, could not marry, a member of the royal family could not marry someone who was not of royal rank. And royal rank was determined by the level of prince that you were. So you could have the title of prince or the title of duke and still be considered of royal rank if you have obtained that rank. Either the emperor has given it to you or you have it from history past. But if you were to marry someone who is not of royal rank, that would decrease your rank. And this is particular. Now, in Britain, this didn't really, this Britain was a lot more liberal in terms of understanding this. But in terms of the German states, if you married morganatically, that is, you married beneath yourself, the person you married would not attain your rank and you would be out of the line of succession. So, for example, this was a big deal in the Austrian Empire when Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, married his wife Sophie. She was of noble rank, but she was not of royal or imperial rank. And that meant that, and so Franz Joseph I, the emperor of the day, said, well, okay, fine, Franz Ferdinand, you're my heir, but when you become emperor, she does not get to be empress, and none of your kids get to inherit the empire. So the idea of rank is incredibly important in European history. And when you need to marry your kids to somebody of an appropriate rank, but you don't want to cause problems in your nation's foreign affairs or in their alliances, or you don't want to make any foreign policy statements that you weren't intending to make, you find a princess from a small German principality somewhere, or a prince from a small German nothing principality somewhere, who will be thrilled to marry into your great royal family, and they're not going to cause problems, and their estate is not going to cause problems because they're frankly too small. And in fact, if you look at, so for example, King George III married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And Mecklenburg-Strelitz is a principality in what is now northern Germany. And if you look at, for example, Catherine the Great, who we all know as Mennonites, Catherine the Great's a big part of our history because she is the one who invited the Mennonites to come from Prussia, from the Vistula Delta, and to move to new lands that she had acquired in Ukraine from the Ottoman Empire. And Catherine is born not a Russian, she is German. And she is born Sophie, and she's a princess of Anhalt-Zerbst, which is notorious for being the smallest German principality at the time. Her father was Prince Christian of Anhalt-Zerbst, and he actually, the principality, I believe, was only about 20 square miles in size. Zerbst had a very small princely palace. They were, as far as princes go, they were quite impoverished. They didn't have big budgets for extra clothes. They had to take measures in terms of economizing. And so when Sophie gets chosen by the Empress Elizabeth to come to Russia to marry Elizabeth's nephew, Peter, who is the heir to the Russian throne, that's a big deal. To go from being a princess of a small nothing German principality to being the Empress of Russia one day is a big, big deal. So this all comes in the context of the Holy Roman Empire. And then when we talk about, for example, the First Crusade, one of the leaders on the Crusades was a guy, or on the Crusades was a guy named Frederick Barbarossa. If you look into that, I believe that was on the Third Crusade, actually. Frederick Barbarossa is an emperor. He is the king of Germany, and he is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And he's a big player when it comes to the crusade, even though he didn't actually make it. I believe he drowned in a river before he got there. But the Holy Roman Empire is important. And even though it kind of seems like a bit player, it really isn't. The power of the empire waxes and wanes. It's not a consistent thing. And it often depended on the personality and on the personal authority of the emperor. There were imperial institutions that existed, institutions that covered the whole empire, but by and large, it was very decentralized. It was a confederation of independent principalities that kind of banded together under fealty to an emperor for personal protection and mutual aid. And the emperor, the empire's territory was focused mainly in Central Europe, Germany, and the Low Countries. So it's the present day Netherlands and Belgium. And it was made up of just a hodgepodge: principalities, kingdoms, duchies, counties, free cities, who all owed fealty to the emperor and who all contributed to it. Now, in the end, the empire was made up of nearly 300 independent realms. So it's a hodgepodge, and different realms had different fealties, sometimes to different princes, and it could be an issue. But generally speaking, by the end, the Holy Roman Empire had really gone brittle and kind of just shattered. So we're going to take a look at the beginning of the empire with Charlemagne. He's the first Holy Roman emperor, and you may have heard of Charlemagne. He's Charles the Great, in the old French Charlemagne. So Charlemagne is what we call him. That's his name. And you can see what his empire looked like on his death in 1814 on this map. So it covers most of France except for Brittany. Brittany is an independent kingdom, and it remains that way it remains independent for a bit in the Middle Ages, because Brittany has a reputation in France of being a very independent-minded area. Bretons are Celtic in origin. They're more Celtic than French, and their dialect of French is much different than in the rest of France. And so, actually, in World War II, it was common for spies who were dropped behind enemy lines in France, when they were on trains, if they were challenged by German authorities or by French customs authorities, or they would simply very gruffly say the word Breton, and then they would be left alone, because they didn't speak, the Germans didn't speak the Breton dialect, they didn't understand it, and a lot of French people didn't understand it either. So that was an easy way to get along, and they're kind of stubborn people too. So this is the empire. You can see it covers parts of Germany, all the way down into Austria, down into Italy, over the Lombard Kingdom, Burgundy, Provence, and even into Spain. Where's my next slide? So what is the foundation of the empire? Where does it start? So in the early 70s, it starts, I'm going to say this first, it starts with the Franks. So the Franks, as you can imagine, are a group of what the Romans would have called barbarians, but they're a tribe that's based in France. And that's where we get the word France, Franks. That's where that comes from. Now, in the early 7th century, there was a guy named Pippin who was awarded the title of Mayor of the Palace by the Merovingian king of the Franks. So the Merovingians are a family, a dynasty name. And so the king of the Franks, who was a member of the Merovingian dynasty, named Pippin mayor of the palace. Now, mayor of the palace is an important position in the Frankish kingdom. Mayors controlled the royal household. He was the intermediary between the king and the nobles, and he also led the army on campaign, and he was served as sort of the king's closest advisor. So he was pretty much like a prime minister with domestic responsibilities. Pippin's family would keep the title of mayor of the palace in the family, and eventually it became as hereditary as the kingship itself. The Merovingians, over time, the kings become less important and the mayors become more important. So this is kind of like the system of a prime minister having the real power in a constitutional democracy, or more accurately, if you're familiar with the history of Japan, Japan up until the 1850s, 1860s had a shogun who was like a warlord who ruled Japan, and the emperor was like a figurehead. That's what the mayor of the palace was like. So about 100 years after Pippin secures the office of mayor of the palace, his descendant, Charles Martel, brings the office essentially to its highest point. And by his time, the office had become, like I was saying, the de facto power in France. or in the Frankish kingdom, and the Merovingian kings had become just mere figureheads and had no political consequence beyond giving moral authority to the mayor's power. Charles was an exceptional administrator and a military leader, and he expanded the Frankish realms tremendously. And he is most famous for defeating the last great Islamic invasion of Western Europe in 732 by destroying a massive Umayyad army outside the city of Tours in central France. So the Umayyads are, just so you're aware, the Umayyads, I think I have a map here actually. So here's a map. On the left-hand side, you can see this where the city of Tours is in France. This is roughly where Charles defeated the Muslims. The Muslims would have gone from the, if you look on the right here, the Islamic Caliphate under the Umayyads had grown to encompass all of the Middle East, all of North Africa, and into Spain. And in fact, the Muslims would rule Spain in, they would have a presence in Spain until 1492, when they are defeated by Ferdinand and Isabella, and they're cast out of the last kingdom they held, which was Granada. But the Islamic influence in Spain is very heavy in the early part of the Middle Ages. And in fact, you can still go see Moorish palaces in Spain. And a lot of Spanish architecture kind of has elements of Moorish. The Moors were the name given to the Islamic community in Spain. They were called Moors by the Europeans. And so Moorish architecture is kind of highly influential on Spanish architecture. But just going back here, so Charles defeats this invasion, and his military prowess is really set in stone by this, because he defeats an army that some people estimate outnumbered him close to 5 to 1 or even 10 to 1. So it's really, really impressive. And he really, in terms of society, he really establishes the feudal hierarchy of Francia. If you remember back to our previous session, I discussed medieval society a bit and feudalism a bit, and this system of interlocking duties and responsibilities that people had towards each other, that peasants had towards the lord, and the lord had toward his lord and to the king. And Charles really firmly establishes this feudal structure in Francia. He redistributes land to new tenants when it's being farmed inefficiently, and he breaks up and has no problem seizing church property, because oftentimes church property is, well, it's just there for the taking, right? They can't defend it, and they're really wealthy and they have a lot of it, so why not seize it and actually make it useful? So he maintained his power through the use of vassalage, and he was so powerful. He was basically the king. And in fact, when the Merovingian king Theodoric IV died in 737, he didn't replace him. He just left an empty throne. There was no need to do it. If you remember the Lord of the Rings, the Steward of Gondor is not the king of Gondor, but there's an empty throne where the king should sit, but the steward is basically acting as the king, kind of thing here. I think you can probably say that Tolkien got a lot of inspiration from this period of history. Martell, by the way, his name Martell is Charles the Hammer. If you see Martell, that's what the title is. So he's Charles the Hammer. Martell is the Old French for hammer. So yeah, Tolkien gets a lot of inspiration here, and then just the name Pippin itself, very influential from here. Okay, so Charles had a son named Pepin the Short, and he succeeded the mayor of the palace in 741. So that's when Charles dies. Now, or when Charles dies, he succeeds as mayor of the palace, and he eventually takes over on his own. Now, he is the victim of a historical clerical error. Despite his nickname, he probably wasn't all that short. And in fact, it's more likely that he was meant to have been called Charles the Younger, or Pepin the Younger, but that got transliterated as the Short, and the Short he remains. So can you imagine being, a 6 foot tall guy in the era of the Middle Ages when all the men are kind of short, and you're supposed to be called the Younger, but you get left with this title of the Short? That's kind of what happens to poor Pepin, but nonetheless, that's the way we remember him. Pepin rules initially with his brother Carloman, but they decided that it was not wise to leave the throne vacant as their father had done. They saw this as a very big unity issue, and so they decided to install another Merovingian on the throne as the moral leader of the kingdom, and they install a guy named Childeric III. Carloman, who is Pepin's brother, eventually leaves his role kind of as the deputy mayor of the palace, and he retires to a monastery, which means Pepin himself is in charge by himself. Pepin decides that the charade of the monarchy is kind of over, and he sends a very carefully worded letter to Pope Zachary. And he asks the Pope, in regard to the kings of the Franks who no longer possess the royal power, is this state of things proper? And in other words, is it proper that the person who holds the power is not the king? And the Pope, who is under the threat of the Lombards and is desperately needing the help of a big military power like the Franks, answers with a very resolute and very well-crafted no. This gives Pepin the moral authority he needs to depose the king. And so he takes King Childeric III, and instead of killing him, as might have happened in the Roman era or in a more barbaric state, he has him tonsured, and he spends the rest of his life in a monastery as a monk. And Pepin then becomes Pepin I, the king of the Franks. From 754 to 756, the Pope and Pepin created a deal called the Donation of Pepin, which established papal control not just of Rome and its surrounding area, but also of Ravenna and other parts of central Italy. So this is kind of where the papal states get formalized. And the Donation of Pepin was partially justified by a forged document called the Donation of Constantine. And the Donation of Constantine basically said, I, Constantine, Emperor of Rome, understand that this empire is far too big for one person to govern on their own. And I therefore give the western part of this empire to the Pope to govern. And that's it was the forgery. It was known as it was declared to be a forgery in the early Renaissance, I believe, when Petrarch and some other early Renaissance men really worked to take down this notion that this Donation of Constantine was real. But it was a forgery that was done probably in the 7th century, and it was influential in establishing this. So Pepin has a son named Charles, and when Pepin dies, he becomes king. And this is Charles I, later known as Charlemagne. He becomes king of the Franks in 774, and he's a very great warrior who expands his kingdom. You saw the extent of the empire in that previous slide. Charlemagne is a patron of the church. He's a proponent of education. He patronizes scholars, the arts, architecture, and literature. And he is so big into education and literature and art and all this kind of stuff that he actually introduces a period called the Carolingian Renaissance. Carolingian is the name of his dynasty. So the Merovingians were succeeded by the Carolingians. And the Carolingian Renaissance. This is like a Renaissance pre the Renaissance. He supported the use of vernacular languages in church and in holy books. So he said, look, why are we writing these things in Latin? Let's have this done in the local language so people can actually understand what's being said and written here. He's a big defender of the papacy from external threats and from rebellion. And Pope Leo III rewards, in quotation marks, Charles's support of the church and him by crowning him Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800 in Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, Charlemagne later claimed that he did not know the Pope was going to crown him emperor, and if he had known, he would not have gone. But why? Why? You're going to go from king to an emperor. Why wouldn't you have wanted to do that? Well, let's take a look at that. So this is the emperor, the Carolingian Empire or how Western Europe looked at the end of Charles's reign. And you can see the Byzantine Empire has some territories close up to his own, but it's really quite reduced from what it was. Now, who is in charge? This is the question that Charlemagne, this is why Charlemagne was so reticent to accept a crown from the Pope. The papal coronation of Charlemagne made several statements. One, it stated that the Empress Irene in the East was an illegitimate emperor, and thus the throne is empty. Remember, she's a woman, and women, the Pope says women can't succeed to the Roman throne, only men can. So the throne is empty, and therefore I can appoint an emperor. And the second thing that it said was that the Pope had the right to create emperors, and by implication, also had the right to remove them. Now, Charlemagne would probably have enjoyed receiving the imperial dignity, but he probably regretted the message that the coronation sent. Papal coronations were sporadic things. They occurred. Sometimes they occurred frequently, sometimes not. But as time went on, they were kind of phased out because some emperors didn't like the idea of the Pope crowning them because it aided the papal idea that the Pope was the ruler of the Western world, not the emperor. So that was a bit of an issue for them. And over time, this battle between popes and emperors over who was in charge would turn into the investiture controversy between Henry IV and Gregory VII, which we'll look at next week, over who had the right to install bishops and abbots. We'll also look at the battle between King Henry in England and Thomas Becket, which was another big blow up in this thing. So if you remember when we were talking about Irene during the session on iconoclasm, basically what happened is that there is this understanding that the emperor in Constantinople was the Roman emperor. And even though there was this understanding that there was a Western throne and an Eastern throne, the West kind of recognized generally that the emperor in Constantinople sat on both. But when Irene takes the throne, the Pope says women can't be emperors, therefore the throne, at least in the West, is empty. And so that's why he feels he can now appoint Charlemagne as the emperor. So the emperor is basically an elective monarchy. So the title passes down from Charlemagne's through Charlemagne's family until about the late 10th century when it becomes elective. Basically, this means that German princes or certain German princes would gather. They would elect a king of Germany, who is called also King of the Romans, and that king would then be crowned by the Pope as emperor. By the mid-1200s, a more formal election system had been established, which gave the right to vote in imperial elections to 7 princes. So these are the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Trier, the Archbishop of Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Princes who were electors took the title of elector, and they would call themselves the Elector of Brandenburg or the Elector of Hanover, for example. Hanover, the King of Hanover was added as an elector later on. This list of electors is kind of the first one, and it would shift around depending on what states became prominent and which ones kind of fell away. So the Elector of Hanover, as we all know, is connected to Canadian history because the electors of Hanover became British monarchs in 1701, I believe, with George I, who was the Elector of Hanover, became King George I. And all kings up until Queen Victoria in the Hanoverian dynasty were electors of Hanover, later kings of Hanover. And that's all kind of connected to us. So that's kind of interesting there, I suppose. But these are sort of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire. And that was a pretty prestigious title. But a democracy, it was not. Imperial elections initially could be swayed. So different factions would put up different candidates to be emperor. But the imperial crown did not initially pass from father to son. It was really more who has the best chance of being the best emperor. And so there's often a lot of wheeling and dealing, and it would change hands between families. But in 1440, the crown passes to Frederick III, the Archduke of Austria, and a member of the Habsburg family. And the Habsburgs would hold on to the crown of the empire until it was dissolved in 1806. So basically, this turned the election of the emperor into a formality. The Habsburgs are probably the most prolific and the most widespread of European royal dynasties, and they are still around today, even though they don't hold a throne. But they are related to almost every royal family in Europe in some way. And so at this point, the empire passed down in the Habsburg dynasty, basically from father to son. Sometimes deals were done where it passed a different way, but in any case, it became basically the property of the Habsburg family from then on. The empire did have a parliament, and it was called a diet, and the diet met at regular intervals to discuss matters of importance to the constituent principalities of the empire. They would pass laws that applied to all the realms in the empire, and they would also bring grievances to the attention of the emperor. And the diet was made up of princes only. It was not popularly elected, so your average person was not in any way represented in this thing. And the empire's strength as an imperial governing entity really depended on the goodwill of the princes and of the strength, military might, and wealth of the sitting emperor. So personality was a big part in imperial politics, and a weak emperor would have very little impact on the empire. But emperors had formal powers in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, don't think that it was just a titular thing. Emperors promulgated and proposed laws that would apply to all the states in the empire. They dealt with tariffs. They led armies in battle in defense of the empire. They could issue pardons. They could also act as a supreme court in certain cases, but only in a formal way. They couldn't just intervene in the affairs of the constituent states unless it was for a certain reason. So it was kind of like almost like a presidential republic kind of thing. But in any case, that's kind of the emperor there. Now, Charles V is the most powerful Holy Roman Emperor to have ever existed. And this had nothing to do with the political positioning of the empire, like, the empire was actually a big major power at this time, but it had everything to do with his personal skill and, more importantly, his massive inheritance. So if you look on the map on the right, Charles possessed Spain. He possessed Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples, which were part of the Kingdom of Spain at the time. He possessed the Burgundian Low Countries, so this is also called the Spanish Netherlands. Believe it or not, Spain held on to the Netherlands until the Reformation. It was governed by Spain. You might not have known that, but the Netherlands, Holland, Belgium were governed by Spain up until the Reformation happened. I'm going to see, I'm kind of in the way here. Oh, well, you can still see the map. And he also held Bohemia, Austria, Hungary, Milan as his personal possessions. And then if you look at the map in the upper left, he also rules the Spanish Empire in North America. So all of Mexico, the southern United States, Peru, Ecuador, Central America, South America, all of it is ruled by Charles V. So he is super powerful, big armies, big budgets, big wealth. And he actually is, his preferred country is actually Brussels. He spends a lot of time in Brussels. That's where he was raised, and he likes Flemish society and Flemish culture. But he's a pretty significant guy. He's a pretty powerful guy. And then, of course, he holds the title as the Habsburg heir. He holds the title of Holy Roman Emperor as well, which gives him authority in Germany. You see there, the German states. Now, Charles is best remembered as the emperor who sat in judgment over Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms, which is a parliamentary gathering, again, of the princes in the empire at the city of Worms in Germany. And Charles, as you remember, as a 19-year-old emperor, he's 19 when he becomes emperor, he condemns Luther and sentences him to death basically as a heretic. And it's only Luther's protector, who is the Elector of Saxony, who saves him. So this kind of shows the Luther's interaction with the emperor and his elector shows the nature of the imperial authority, that the emperor can declare him an outlaw, but if the local prince doesn't want him to be an outlaw, nobody's going to enforce that. So that's kind of what happened for Luther. Charles is also, so this is Luther here at the Diet of Worms. So, oh, I see. I missed this joke. Sorry. So I meant what it was going to look like if I had done this properly. It was like, Charles is the most remembered as the emperor who sat in judgment of Luther at the Diet of Worms. This, not this. That was going to be the joke. I apologize. I missed that. I thought that was kind of clever. Anyway, Charles is also the nephew. He also plays another part in European history because he's the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, who is the wife or the first wife of Henry VIII. And if you remember Henry VIII, he has six wives, and we remember them as the 6 wives of Henry VIII. We'll talk about the English Reformation a little bit more because England is kind of my area of expertise if I had to have one. But so his first wife is Catherine of Aragon. His second wife is Anne Boleyn. His third wife is Jane. Third wife is it Jane? Oh, sorry guys, I'm just blanking here. Oh, Jane Seymour. I was right. I was going to say Jane Seymour. Oh, goodness. This is embarrassing. Anyway, so his third wife is, so there's Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour. Then you have Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. Those are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And you remember them: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's how you remember what happened to them. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Catherine of Aragon, number 1, divorced. Now you remember this, you'll probably remember this, is that Henry VIII wanted a son. And there's a lot to this, but basically what happened is he was happily married to Catherine for a long time. She bore several children, some of them were boys, they all died, except for one child, Mary, who survived. Mary was going to be Henry's heir, and they were happily married for 20 years until such time as he met Anne Boleyn, who was a bit of a temptress. Some might call her, well, we won't say those words here, but in any case, Anne Boleyn seduces the king, and the king decides she can provide me with the heir I want. She doesn't, but so he divorces Catherine. Now the Pope, Henry's a Catholic, and he's a good Catholic. He's the best Catholic. He's kind of like, he's a little bit like Donald Trump. You know, if you were saying, if there's anybody who's the best, there's no Catholic better than me. I am the best Catholic. Perfect. There's no Catholic better than me. Henry was given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope because he wrote a treatise against Martin Luther. He refuted Martin Luther in this massive treatise, and the Pope was so impressed he gave him the title Defender of the Faith. When Henry asks the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine, he does it on the grounds that his marriage to Catherine was illegal because Catherine was originally betrothed to his brother Arthur, who died, and canon law forbids brothers from marrying their brothers' wives. I don't, even if they're dead, I don't understand quite why. But in any case, that was what it was. The Pope has a problem. He is conveniently under the control of Charles V. Pope Clement VII and Charles had a bit of a dispute, and Charles's troops had at this time captured Rome and were holding the Pope hostage and ransacking the city itself. And that's when Henry's request for an annulment comes through. And the Pope is asked to dissolve the marriage of the Emperor's aunt to the King of England on the grounds that she is an illegitimate wife. Is that going to happen? No, that's not going to happen. The Pope, between a rock and a boulder, we won't even say a hard place. He's like more in between two granite cliffs with a very narrow gorge in between. He delays, and then he says no, and then Henry gets mad, and poof, everything blows up for the English church. But we'll talk about that later. So Charles plays a big role in the Reformation with Martin Luther, and he plays a big role in the Reformation of the English church. And he actually, it seems that he does a lot to spread Protestantism, which is odd because he was a very good Catholic. In fact, all Holy Roman emperors were Catholic. There are no Protestant ones. But as time goes on, the empire got more brittle and less flexible. So basically, the fealties to the emperor didn't really matter as much as time went on. The imperial title was it became more of a title, less of a position kind of thing. By the 18th century, it had about 1,800 small territories, estates, dukedoms, grand duchies, and principalities and kingdoms, and about 300 of those would have been significant, in quotation marks. All these groups nominally owed fealty to the emperor, but most were so small that their princes had to support themselves by working for bigger royal families in France, Austria, Russia, or England. And the empire is dissolved in 1806 by Napoleon, who had conquered most of it, frankly, and it was succeeded by the Austrian Empire, which basically was an attempt to allow the Habsburgs to keep the title of emperor. So the last Holy Roman Emperor is a guy named Francis II, and Francis II dissolves the empire at Napoleon's behest, and he says, "Very well, I am now Francis I, Emperor of Austria." And and since he has direct control as an absolute monarch over Austria and its territories, he's actually more of an emperor there than he ever was in the Holy Roman Empire. So this is what it looks like in 1789. This is just about 16, 17 years or so before its dissolution. And you can see the very fragmented nature of the empire. You have the Austrian territories there in the southeast, Prussia and Brandenburg in the northeast, and then all these tiny little principalities and kingdoms. But by and large, it's all kind of just falling apart. The Dutch Republic up north there, the Austrians controlling their territories there. So the question is, why does the Holy Roman Empire matter? So it's important to realize that this is it was a significant political entity. It had an impact in the church, and we'll look more at the investiture controversy in particular. But it also was one of the great defenders of papal power. And as much as the Pope and the Emperor were often at each other's throats, the Emperor often defended the Emperor against aggression as well. If you want to look at this in a more of an academic sense, I think it would be fair to say that the empire served as a battleground to test the intersections of secular and religious authority. And that testing is very important because as the church becomes more powerful, there's the question of what is the appropriate intersection of these two groups? To what extent does the church have to submit to secular authority, or to what extent does the secular authority have to submit to the church? Nowadays, it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous notion that we as a church would think that the secular powers have to submit to us in any way. But back then, it really wasn't. The church was a massive institution, and the Pope was a secular ruler as well as a spiritual one. And so the claim, and we have to also remember that religion played a far bigger role in people's lives back then than it does now. And the authority that the Pope had, particularly over afterlife and the theology of the church and his role in the common minds of citizens, made this a very important thing to settle, to get straight. And as we're going to see, that got messy. And it wasn't entirely ever resolved to the satisfaction of either party. But if we're going to look at Rome as being important as the flower bed in which the church, if you want to think of the church as a flower or a plant, and Rome as the flower bed in the Roman Empire, The Roman Empire, as I said previously, provided protection to the church to plant and root and grow and become a solid organization before it faced massive persecution. The Holy Roman Empire provided the seedbed to test secular and religious authority, the intersections of that, and to find some sort of compromise and common ground. And it also was the seed ground of the Reformation. The Reformation could not, in my opinion, have taken place in any other entity than in the Roman Empire. If you want to look at, when we look at the proto-reformers, the guys who tried to reform the church in before the formal period we know as the Restoration, before Martin Luther, they all did so out of or in places where the state and the church was much more cohesive. So in England, in France, in Bohemia, even in Italy, the church's establishment the church's establishment in the state was, and the fact that these states were very unitary, they were unified, they weren't fragmented, there weren't little internal rivalries and divisions, meant that if you outlawed a proto-reformer in England, if he was declared an outlaw and a heretic, he could flee to Scotland, he could flee to Wales, he could flee anywhere he wanted in England, didn't matter, the authority would apply. The law would apply, he's a heretic. But in Luther's time, because of the fragmented nature of the Holy Roman Empire, and the fact that the princes were sovereigns in their own state, the emperor had extremely limited authority in the principalities. There were some imperial territories in the empire that he ruled as a king would rule, where he was the direct prince. But most of the time, he has to deal with princes who are largely independent in their own domestic affairs. It's that allows Luther and the Reformation to foment and to grow, because Luther is protected by his prince. If his prince had been an uber Catholic who decided that he was a threat to the church and he was going to be executed, Luther would not have survived. But Luther was a beneficiary of the fragmented nature of the Holy Roman Empire. And the fragmented nature of the Holy Roman Empire lasts a long time. You can see this, I think, as divine providence, I think, because there's no reason an entity like the Holy Roman Empire should have lasted as long as it did if it did not have a purpose. And I believe that purpose was for the massive reform of the church that we saw during the Reformation. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I think that that's a pretty good explanation as to why it's important. And like I said, next week, we're going to look at the investiture controversy and the controversy of the scandal, if you will, of Thomas à Becket. And we're going to discuss a bit this secular, sacred battle between kings and emperors and the Pope as to who is superior and who has authority over what. So this lesson is going to be a little bit shorter, like I said. To do a primer on the Holy Roman Empire is difficult, and I don't know if I've raised more questions for you, if I've confused you. If I have, by all means, you ask me questions. I love questions, and I will try and clear up any issues that you, or any questions that you might have, and to make them to make things a little bit more clear. I hear rumblings that the restrictions on churches and public gatherings may become loosened in this next week. I do not know. We will see what that looks like when that comes, but that may allow us to return to more in-person gatherings. So if that does, I will certainly let you know. Otherwise, we will continue here on YouTube. And I will also endeavor to have any in-person lectures or sessions filmed so that I can put those up on YouTube, if not live, then after the fact, so that you can review them if you can't be there. So I hope you guys all have a great week. Please do message me if you have any questions, and we'll see you later.